Years of patience boiled down into one sentence: I'm exhausted. Choose me or your mother. She expected support, an apology, at least some sign of understanding. But her husband only smirked and walked toward the closet to pack her things. He was so sure of his power and his righteousness in this home. Only he'd overlooked one crucial detail. Hello, dear listeners. I'm happy to welcome you back to my channel. Here's a brand new and captivating story for you. Enjoy. Margaret stood by the window of her two-bedroom apartment on the 7th floor, looking out at the evening city. Chicago glittered with lights, cars hummed somewhere below, and inside her own home there was the smell of fried potatoes and the muffled sound of yet another TV drama about an unfortunate woman everyone betrayed. The TV had been on for 3 hours straight, and Margaret clenched her fists unconsciously as she stared at her reflection in the glass. 6 months ago, she couldn't have imagined her life would turn into some absurd stage play. Back in February, Christopher had called her at work, sounding frantic, and said his mother needed surgery. A serious one on her knee. In Springfield, where Linda had lived all her life, the wait list for surgeries like that stretched out for a year. But in Chicago, a doctor Christopher knew could take her quickly. For a price, of course. Margaret, please. Christopher had begged back then, his voice so pitiful she couldn't hold out. It hurts her to walk. She'll stay for a month, get the surgery, or the amputation, and go back. Really, it's just 1 month, that's nothing. Margaret had sighed and agreed. Of course she did. She was one of those people who simply didn't know how to say no. Linda arrived in early March with 3 massive bags stuffed with jars of jam, dried meat wrapped in newspaper, and some random cloths. Margaret helped her settle into the small guest room, laid out fresh sheets, even put flowers on the windowsill. The surgery was done a week later. Margaret paid for everything herself, $18,000 she'd saved for a summer trip to Greece. Christopher promised to pay her back, but somehow the money never materialized. He needed a new laptop for work, then something else came up. Margaret waved it off. Fine. Health comes first. Greece could wait. After the surgery, Linda stayed for rehabilitation. Which made sense, her leg hurt, walking was difficult. Margaret didn't even object when her mother-in-law took over her favorite armchair in the living room and parked herself there under a blanket in front of the TV. Let her rest, she was recovering. But a month passed. Then another. Linda's leg had long healed, and she was energetically buzzing around the apartment, cooking, cleaning, but not leaving. When Margaret cautiously hinted one day that, well, things in Springfield must be waiting, and her apartment there was sitting empty, Linda threw up her hands and wailed that she was scared to be alone, that the neighbors were strange, that she was weak after surgery, and how could anyone throw a sick woman out on the street? Naturally, Christopher took his mother's side. He always did. 32 years old and still a mama's boy. He'd grown up with a mother who solved everything for him, knew everything better, ran his life top to bottom. At first, Margaret even thought his devotion to his mother was cute, endearing. A grown man caring so much about an older woman. But over time it became painfully clear, Christopher didn't care about being kind. He just feared conflict. Any conflict. And he preferred to ignore anything that could disturb his peace. Mom, you know she really struggles alone, he would say whenever Margaret tried bringing up the topic. Just be patient, what does it cost you? She's not bothering anyone. Not bothering. Margaret barely kept herself from laughing out loud. Linda had turned the apartment into her little Springfield kingdom. She woke up at 6, shuffled through the hallway, banged pots in the kitchen, turned on the radio. Margaret woke up to that racket and lay there with her eyes wide open, cursing the day she agreed to this temporary hospitality. The kitchen now followed Linda's rules. The fridge was reorganized according to her system, top shelf for soup, second for meat, bottom for vegetables. Margaret's yogurts and cottage cheese ended up shoved into the farthest corner and 2 weeks later disappeared altogether. I threw that chemical garbage out, the mother-in-law declared when Margaret asked where her food went. Just dyes and preservatives. That's stuff for dumb women who fall for pretty packaging. I'll buy you real cottage cheese at the farmer's market. Homemade. You'll be healthy. Margaret stayed quiet then, just turned around and walked to her room. She sat on the bed and held her knees tightly so she wouldn't explode. She'd bought that cottage cheese with her own money, she liked it. And now she didn't even get to choose what she ate in her own home. Then things got worse. Linda cooked only what Christopher liked: fried potatoes with onions, meatballs with pasta, chili with sour cream. Margaret, who'd spent years watching her figure and eating vegetables and steamed chicken, looked at those mountains of greasy food with despair. "Why aren't you eating?" the mother-in-law asked every time Margaret declined seconds. "You're too skinny. Christopher needs a real wife, a healthy one, not a skeleton. When I was your age, I was full of life, a real beauty." Margaret silently finished her portion and got up to wash the dishes. Hers, Christopher's, Linda's. Her mother-in-law would settle into the armchair after dinner and switch the TV to her favorite channel: soap operas about tragic love, cheating husbands, evil mothers-in-law, and poor women everyone mistreated. Linda watched them for hours, sniffing at the sad scenes and commenting aloud. "Oh, look at that bastard. And she's still putting up with it. I'd have walked out ages ago." Margaret sometimes wanted to ask why. Then, Linda didn't walk out and instead camped in someone else's apartment, but she held back. For now. The TV blared until 11 at night, and only after Linda went to bed could Margaret finally relax. The bathroom became its own battleground. Linda spread her countless jars, bottles, sponges, and cloths all over the place. Margaret's cosmetics, her expensive creams and serums she bought with her own salary, vanished from the shelf. "I put them in the storage cabinet so they wouldn't get in the way," Linda explained when Margaret discovered the disappearance. "Why do you need so many? I've used baby cream my whole life. And look, my skin is fine." Margaret looked at her mother-in-law's face, covered in a web of wrinkles and dark spots, and wished she hadn't said anything. But out loud, she said nothing. She simply retrieved her creams from the cabinet and hid them in her room. At least there she could have something of her own. The apartment belonged to Margaret. She'd bought it herself before she ever met Christopher. She worked as a manager at a large company, saved up, got a mortgage, paid it off in 3 years. When she and Christopher got married, he simply moved in. They didn't sign a prenup. Why would they, when you love someone? Margaret had been sure Christopher was the kind of man she could trust with her future. He was kind, calm, didn't drink, didn't cheat. He worked as a programmer and made good money. Though somehow his money always ran out before his next paycheck, and then he borrowed from Margaret, promising to pay her back, but somehow forgetting. Margaret didn't remind him. It was just money. Peace in the family mattered more. Only now there was no peace. Linda had taken over not just the space in the apartment, but also her son's attention. Christopher talked more with his mother now than with his wife. They discussed their own topics, laughed at jokes only they understood. Margaret sat nearby and felt like a stranger in her own home. And then there were the friends. Linda managed to find old acquaintances from Springfield who'd also moved to Chicago to live near their children. Now she regularly invited them over. They sat on Margaret's couch, drank tea with jam, and discussed life. "Oh, Linda, it's so cozy here. What a spacious apartment." Christopher really landed on his feet. Margaret heard these conversations and clenched her teeth every single time. Christopher landed on his feet. Christopher, who hadn't paid a single cent for this apartment. Christopher, who lived here as a guest but acted like the rightful owner. But she stayed silent because she didn't want drama. She didn't want her husband to think she was a troublemaker. Christopher seemed completely oblivious to everything that was happening. Whenever Margaret tried to talk to him in private, he brushed her off. At first gently, then with growing irritation. "What is it now?" he would say without looking up from his laptop. "Mom is old, it's hard for her to be alone. Just be patient a little longer. She won't be here forever." "Christopher, it's already been 6 months, Margaret said quietly, trying not to raise her voice. 6 months, and her leg healed ages ago. When is she leaving?" "I don't know, soon. Don't push her, you know how that looks. I don't want my mother thinking she's not welcome here. Christopher, this is my apartment. I'm the one who owns it. I have the right to decide who lives here and for how long." There you go again. Christopher finally tore his eyes away from the screen and looked at her with annoyance. My apartment, my apartment. What, am I a stranger here now? We're a family, or am I wrong? Or do you care more about square footage than actual human relationships? Margaret went silent. She didn't want to fight, didn't know how. She'd grown up in a family where arguments were shameful, where you were taught to endure and stay quiet. So she endured. But inside, something heavy and sharp was growing day by day: resentment, anger, exhaustion. She worked from 9 to 6, came home exhausted, and instead of peace and comfort she walked into more noise, a loud mother-in-law who greeted her with complaints. Either Margaret washed a cup wrong, or she hung a towel in the wrong place, or she came home too late. You should come back earlier, Linda would say, shaking her head. A husband needs attention. You're always about work, work, work. Career woman. And what about home? What about family? When I was your age, I already had Christopher, kept the whole apartment spotless, cooked steaks for my husband. And you? You only think about yourself. Margaret would silently walk into the kitchen, heat up dinner, the same chili Linda cooked, and eat alone. Christopher was usually already full, sitting in the bedroom on his computer. Linda was planted in front of the TV. Margaret chewed her food and thought that this was some kind of nightmare. Was this really her life now? Was this forever? But the worst part was that Christopher was changing. He had at least tried to be attentive before, asked how she was, hugged her before bed, gave her compliments. Now he seemed distant, spending more time with his mother and treating Margaret like some kind of nuisance. She tried talking to him, but he answered in short, distracted phrases, as if she wasn't even there. One evening Margaret couldn't hold it anymore and said, "Christopher, can we at least go somewhere this weekend? Just the two of us. A movie or a cafe. We haven't gone out in 3 months." "Can't," he said without looking away from the screen. "Mom gets lonely. You know she has no one here." "She has friends," Margaret replied. "They come over every week." "So what?" "She still needs support. She's in a strange city, it's hard for her." "Don't be selfish, Margaret." "Selfish." Margaret froze in the doorway, trying to process that word. Selfish. She's the one who let his mother into her home, paid for her surgery, endured her behavior for 6 months. She was selfish. But Christopher and his mother were saints, apparently. She turned and went into the bathroom. Locked the door, turned on the water, and sat on the edge of the tub staring at the white tiles. Inside, everything twisted into a tight knot. She wanted to cry, but no tears came. Just emptiness, cold and heavy. She didn't sleep that night. She lay next to her husband, who snored softly with his back to her, and wondered what came next. Was this how she'd live the rest of her life? Linda had firmly settled in and clearly wasn't planning to leave. Christopher saw no problem with that. And she, Margaret, was expected to endure it. For how long? A year? 2? 10? The next day at the office, a coworker asked if she was okay. Margaret nodded, forced a smile, lied that she was just tired. Her coworker nodded sympathetically and suggested she take a vacation. A vacation? Margaret wanted to laugh. Where could she possibly go? On vacation from her own apartment, which her mother-in-law was running like a commander. That evening she came home, and the first thing she heard was Linda's voice. She was talking on the phone in the kitchen. Margaret stopped in the hallway, took off her shoes, and couldn't help listening. "No, everything's fine, Helen, I'm all settled here," Linda said cheerfully. "The apartment's great, everything I need. Christopher is happy I'm here, and that wife of his keeps quiet. What can she say? She knows my boy will never kick me out." Margaret froze, clutching her keys. Never kick her out. Linda wasn't even hiding it anymore if she was planning to stay. Forever. Margaret walked quietly to the bedroom, closed the door, and sat on the bed. She wanted to scream, smash dishes, throw that rude woman out right then and there. But instead she just sat and stared out the window. Sometimes you get so tired of fighting that you can't even be angry anymore. You just sit and wonder why you're even putting up with all of it. At dinner Linda was especially chatty. She told Christopher she'd run into her old friend Gloria at the market. How they chatted all day, how wonderful Chicago was. Christopher listened, nodded, smiled. Margaret silently ate her meatball and imagined standing up, grabbing her apartment papers and laying them right in the middle of the table. So both of them would finally understand who the real owner here was. But she didn't do it. She just finished dinner, washed the dishes, and went back to the bedroom. Lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling. 6 months. 6 months her life had been one long absurdity with no end in sight. Wednesday morning started the usual way, with pots clanging in the kitchen and Linda's cheerful humming. Margaret opened her eyes and looked at the clock. 6:30. She could have slept another 40 minutes, but sleep was gone, chased away by someone else's busy morning routine in her own apartment. She lay there listening to her mother-in-law shuffle down the hallway in her slippers, the fridge opening and closing, something sizzling in the pan. Christopher was curled up beside her, snoring softly. Nothing bothered him. He could sleep through an artillery barrage. Margaret had known that forever. But it wasn't about the noise. It was the feeling she woke up with every morning that she was living in someone else's home. Margaret got up, put on her robe, and went to the kitchen. Linda stood by the stove in a bright pink terrycloth robe she'd brought from Springfield. The robe was worn to threads, but she wore it proudly, insisting it was pure cotton, not some synthetic junk. "Oh, finally awake." Linda tossed over her shoulder. "I'm making Christopher some eggs." "You don't need any. I guess you're always on some diet." "Good morning," Margaret replied evenly, pouring herself a glass of water. "Thanks, I'll make my own breakfast." "Suit yourself, just don't complain later that you're hungry." "I always eat well in the morning, that's why I'm healthy." Margaret stayed silent and pulled her yogurt from the fridge, a miracle it survived this time. She sat at the table, opened her phone, and scrolled through the news. Linda plated the eggs and showered them with dill. "Christopher," she yelled toward the bedroom. "Get up, son, breakfast is ready." Margaret winced. Christopher. He was 32 years old, and his mother still called him like he was 5. And he loved it. He even once said it was cute. Cute. Margaret had blinked in disbelief, unsure what to say. Christopher came out 5 minutes later, rumpled, in sweatpants and an old t-shirt. He kissed his mother on the cheek, sat down, and dug in. Margaret finished her yogurt, stood up, and went to get ready for work. The office was calmer than home. Strange as it sounded, work had become the one place where Margaret could finally breathe. No one ordered her around here, no one criticized her food choices, no one blasted TV dramas at full volume. Here she was just Margaret the manager, competent, respected, and valued by her colleagues. "Margaret, hey." Her coworker Susan peeked into her office, holding a cup of coffee. "You okay? You look exhausted." "I'm fine." Margaret answered automatically, smiling. "Just a little tired." "Hey, want to go somewhere for lunch?" "A new cafe opened nearby, they say it's great." Margaret was about to agree she really wanted to, but then remembered that her mother-in-law's friends were coming over today. And Linda had ordered her to buy a pie for tea. Ordered, not asked. As if Margaret were some kind of maid. "Can't, Susan." "Got stuff to do," Margaret lied, and Susan nodded sympathetically before heading back to her desk. The day dragged on slowly. Margaret sorted documents, answered emails, called clients, but her mind was somewhere far away. She kept catching herself thinking about home, about Linda, about Christopher. About the fact that things simply couldn't go on like this. But what could she do? Kick Linda out? Christopher would hate her for it, he'd make a scene. And she wasn't built for scenes. She couldn't fight. Accept it? But how do you accept something that boils with injustice inside you? By 4 o'clock she was completely drained by her own thoughts and decided to leave early. Her boss didn't mind the work was done. Margaret packed her things, called a cab, and rode home. She stopped by a store and bought a Napoleon cake. Linda had a sweet tooth. When she opened the apartment door, she immediately heard voices. The friends had already arrived. 4 older women sat in the living room on the couch, in the armchairs, sipping tea from Margaret's favorite cups and munching on cookies. Linda sat in the center, animatedly telling some story, waving her hands. "Oh, Margaret's here." Linda pursed her lips. "Why are you so early? Skipped work?" Good afternoon, Margaret greeted the guests politely and carried the cake to the kitchen. Behind her she heard whispering. Then giggles. She placed the cake on the counter, took off her heels, and was about to escape to her room, but Linda called after her. Margaret, come join us, have some tea. Thanks, I'm tired. I'll lie down for a bit. Tired, Linda snorted loudly to her friends. That's the youth now, always tired. When we were their age, we worked all day and then came home and did everything else. Raised kids. And they're tired. Oh, absolutely, agreed one of the friends, a heavy woman with big gold earrings. They're all spoiled these days. Margaret clenched her teeth and walked into her room. She closed the door, sat on the bed, and held her head in her hands. Spoiled. She was spoiled. She's the one who paid for this apartment, for utilities, for groceries. Spoiled. Laughter and chatter drifted from the living room for another 2 hours. Margaret lay on the bed, face buried in the pillow, trying not to listen. But the words still slipped through the door. This place is so nice, Linda, you're lucky. Oh yes, Christopher has plenty of room. So, when are the grandkids coming? Or does she not want kids? Care about her career, that's what. Family is second for her. Margaret closed her eyes and inhaled deeply. Counted to 10. Then again. And again. She didn't want to go out there. Didn't want to see those judgmental faces. Didn't want to hear strangers discuss her life in her own home. The guests finally left around 7. Margaret heard the front door slam, heard Linda clattering dishes in the kitchen. She got up, washed her face with cold water, and stepped out. She had to eat something, though she had no appetite at all. Christopher was already at the table, devouring buckwheat with meatballs. Linda was getting herself seconds. Sit, eat, she nodded at Margaret. You just hide in your room while we're trying to have dinner. I was resting, Margaret said calmly as she sat. Her head throbbed. Head, Linda repeated with a smirk. Young people always have something hurting. When my leg hurt for real after surgery, I didn't whine. Christopher kept chewing, staring into his plate. Margaret looked at him, hoping for him to say something in her defense. But he said nothing. Just ate in silence. Dinner passed in suffocating quiet. Margaret ate a bit of buckwheat, the food tasted like cardboard. Then she stood, washed the dishes, and went back to her room. TV voices burst from the living room, some talk show host shouting at full volume. Margaret lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling. Do you know what it feels like to be a guest in your own apartment? She bought these walls, these windows, this hardwood floor. She paid the mortgage for 3 years, cutting expenses to pay it off sooner. And now some woman from Springfield was living here like the lady of the house, while Margaret hid in her room just to avoid the barbs. The next day was a little easier. No friends, no visitors. Linda watched her soaps all day and barely left the living room. After work, Margaret stopped at the store, bought herself a salad and yogurt, came home and ate quietly in the kitchen while Linda was busy watching yet another drama about a cheating husband and a suffering wife. Christopher came home late, around 10. Margaret was already in bed, reading on her phone. He walked in, changed clothes, and flopped down beside her. How are you? He asked with a yawn. Fine, Margaret answered shortly, without looking up. Mom says your head hurt yesterday. Yeah. It did. You should have taken something. I did. Christopher hesitated, then turned toward her. Hey, why are you so? I don't know. Distant lately? Did I do something? Margaret put her phone aside and looked him straight in the eyes. Really looked. He lay on his side, propping his head with his hand, staring at her with mild confusion as if he truly didn't understand. Christopher, your mom has been living here for 6 months, Margaret began slowly, keeping her voice steady. 6 months. She's not leaving. She acts like she owns the place. And I feel like a guest in my own apartment. There you go again, Christopher sighed and rolled onto his back. That same old song. Margaret, Mom is an older woman, she needs support. Is it so hard to be patient? How long? Margaret asked. How long am I supposed to be patient? Another 6 months? A year? 5 years? I don't know. Christopher snapped. But you know I can't just toss her out on the street. She's my mother. And who am I? Margaret asked quietly. I'm your wife. Doesn't my opinion matter to you? It does, of course it does, Christopher said quickly, but there was no conviction in his voice. Just, let's not do this now, okay? I'm tired. We'll talk tomorrow. He turned toward the wall and was snoring within 5 minutes. Margaret lay beside him, eyes open, knowing they wouldn't talk tomorrow. They would never talk. Because Christopher didn't want that conversation. He liked things exactly as they were. Mom nearby, wife enduring it. Everything quiet and comfortable. Several more days passed. Life moved the same way: work, home, Linda, TV, silent dinners. Margaret tried to spend as little time as possible in shared spaces. She came home, ate in the kitchen while Linda watched her dramas, then went straight to her room. Read books, scrolled social media, watched movies with headphones. Christopher barely noticed her distance or pretended not to. On Friday evening, Margaret came home a little earlier than usual. She'd stopped by the pharmacy for vitamins. Lately she'd felt completely drained. She opened the door with her key, stepped into the hallway, and immediately heard voices from the kitchen. Linda was talking to someone. Margaret took off her shoes, ready to head to her room, when suddenly she heard her own name. What good is she to you, Christopher? Linda said, her voice annoyed and grumbling. Always at work, you can't get anything out of her at home, she's useless as a homemaker. When I was her age dash. Mom, stop already, Christopher muttered, but his voice held no firmness at all. Margaret froze in the hallway. Something inside her tightened painfully. Stop what? I'm telling the truth, Linda continued. Look at her, doesn't want kids, only cares about her job. A career woman. Why do you need a wife like that? Mom, don't, Christopher mumbled again. I will. Linda insisted. Listen to me, I'm your mother, I won't give you bad advice. Just divorce her, and the apartment is yours. You won't have to split anything, you'll keep it all. I'll find you a local girl here, a good one, a real homemaker from a decent family. And that one. That career girl can go wherever she wants. Margaret clapped a hand over her mouth. The blood drained from her face, her temples pounded. She stood in her own hallway listening to her mother-in-law plan a divorce and the theft of her apartment. Her apartment. Oh, come on, Mom, Christopher drawled, and in his voice there was something: agreement, acceptance. It's too early to think about that. Too early. Too early. Meaning he wasn't against it. He just thought the time hadn't come yet. Margaret stood frozen, unable to move. The world tilted. She suddenly understood she was standing on the edge of a cliff. That the husband she loved, the man she'd lived with for 4 years, was calmly discussing with his mother how to divorce her. And not just divorce her, how to take her apartment. Now that's my smart boy, Linda said with satisfaction. Think about it, son. I want what's best for you. A place like this shouldn't end up in the hands of strangers. Strangers. To Linda, Margaret was a stranger. Margaret, the one who let this woman into her home, paid for her surgery, endured her behavior for 7 months. A stranger. Margaret turned and quietly, very quietly slipped out into the hallway of the building. She leaned her back against the wall and closed her eyes. Breathing was difficult, a lump stuck in her throat. She stood like that for 2 minutes, trying to calm down. Then pulled out her phone and pretended to talk, just in case anyone stepped out of the apartment. 5 minutes later she walked back inside, this time slamming the door loudly. The voices in the kitchen cut off instantly. Margaret went to the bedroom, dropped her bag on the bed, and sat down hugging her knees. Inside, everything burned. Not from hurt, from rage. Cold, clear rage. So that's how it was. They were discussing how to get rid of her and take the apartment. Linda was convinced the place belonged to her son. And Christopher? Christopher didn't correct her. Didn't tell his mother the apartment wasn't his. He just mumbled something vague. Because it benefited him. Because he wanted the apartment to be his, too. Margaret stood up and went to the closet. She opened the top shelf and pulled out a folder with documents. The ownership certificate was neatly filed inside. She took it out, unfolded it, and looked at the lines. Owner Margaret Eleanor Thompson. Date of purchase 2 years before marrying Christopher. There had never been a prenup. So legally, the apartment belonged only to her. Only to her. She put the document back in its folder and sat on the bed. Her thoughts spun, forming a plan. She needed to prepare. She couldn't act impulsively. She couldn't make a scene now. She had to wait for the right moment. Margaret spent the weekend in a strange state. Outwardly she was calm, made breakfast, lunch, dinner. Answered questions. Even smiled once or twice. But inside, cold. She looked at Christopher and no longer saw a husband, she saw a traitor. She looked at Linda and thought, "You'll regret ever coming here." On Saturday, Margaret went to a hardware store and ordered a new lock for the front door. A good one, solid and reliable. She told the clerk she'd be changing it next week. He nodded, wrote down the address, promised delivery within 2 days. Margaret paid, walked outside, and felt something warm spread inside her. Not joy, satisfaction. She was preparing. On Monday evening, Linda invited her friends over again. Margaret came home from work to find the usual scene. For older women in the living room, tea, cookies, gossip. This time she didn't hide in her room. She went to the kitchen, took out her yogurt, and calmly sat down at the table. "Oh, Margaret's here," noted one of the friends, the heavy one with the big gold earrings. "How's work?" "Fine," Margaret answered shortly, eyes still on her phone. "What, you get married just to work?" chimed in another woman thin, in a knitted cardigan. "When I was your age, I stayed home and raised kids." "Everyone has their own life," Margaret said evenly, finishing her yogurt. "Well, sure," Linda snorted. "Career, work. Family is somewhere at the bottom of the list." Margaret stood up, threw the yogurt cup away, and walked past the living room toward her bedroom. Whispers and giggles followed her. She didn't care. They could say whatever they wanted. Soon they'd all be quiet. On Tuesday the locksmith arrived. Margaret had asked him to come during the day when the apartment would be empty. Linda was visiting her friend Gloria, Christopher was at work. The locksmith quickly removed the old lock and installed the new one. Margaret asked him to make 4 keys. She kept all 4 and paid. "This lock's solid," the locksmith said as he packed his tools. "No one's getting through it easily." "Thank you," Margaret nodded, seeing him out. She took the old lock, wrapped it in a bag, and tossed it in the dumpster outside. Then she went back up and waited. In the evening, Christopher came home from work, put his key in the door, and froze. "What the hell?" he muttered, trying to turn it. The lock stuck. "I changed it," Margaret said calmly from the hallway. The old one wasn't working well. "You changed it?" Christopher stared at her, confused. "And you'll give me a key?" "Of course." Margaret handed him one. "Here." Christopher took it, turned it in his hand, and slipped it into his pocket. He didn't ask anything else. Linda also got her key when she returned from her walk. Margaret handed it to her without comment. "Why'd you change it?" Linda grumbled. "The old one worked fine." "It makes me feel safer," Margaret replied, and her voice had steel in it. Linda glanced at her daughter-in-law but didn't argue. Something in Margaret's eyes warned her not to. Margaret kept the 2 spare keys. One went into her purse. The other into her desk drawer at work. If she ever had to replace the lock again, she'd be ready. On Wednesday evening, Margaret sat in the kitchen, drinking tea and looking out the window. Christopher was in the bedroom, doing something on his computer. Linda, as usual, was watching a soap opera. Margaret listened to the TV. The woman on the screen was screaming at her husband, accusing him of cheating, and she smirked. Real life worked the same way. Except betrayal wasn't always physical. Sometimes it was betrayal of trust, betrayal of family, betrayal of the person who believed in you. She finished her tea, washed her cup, and walked to the bedroom. Christopher sat at the desk, glued to his monitor. "Christopher, we need to talk," Margaret said, closing the door behind her. Uh-huh, he replied, not looking up. I'm serious. Look at me. He sighed and turned toward her. All right, talk. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, folding her hands on her knees. Your mother has been living here for 7 months. 7, Christopher. She's not planning to leave. I need to know how long this will continue. I don't know, Christopher shrugged. She's not ready to live alone yet. And when will she be ready? How would I know? Christopher, this is my apartment. I have the right to decide who lives here and for how long. There you go again. Christopher exploded, jumping up from his chair. That same old song. My apartment. Mine. What am I, a guest here now? No, not a guest. You're my husband. But your mother is a guest, and she acts like she owns the place. That's because you treat her terribly. Christopher shot back. She feels it. You're cold, distant, you never talk to her like a human being. Margaret stared at him, and she didn't recognize him. This was her husband speaking. The man who promised to love and protect her. I treat her terribly, Margaret repeated slowly. I let her into my home. I paid for her surgery. I've endured her behavior for 7 months. And that's terrible treatment? Well, what do you want that I throw her out? Christopher's fists clenched, his face red. She's my mother. My only mother. And if you don't like it, then what? Margaret asked quietly, looking him straight in the eyes. Nothing, Christopher snapped and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Margaret stayed sitting on the bed. Her hands were trembling. She clenched them into fists, trying to steady herself. She breathed deeply, counted to 10. Not now. Not now. Just a little more patience. The next day at the office she was distracted. Susan noticed again and asked if everything was okay. Margaret nodded, lied about having a headache. Susan suggested taking a day off, but Margaret refused. Work was the only place where she could escape the chaos of home even a little. That evening she came home and found that Linda had rearranged the living room furniture. The couch was now against a different wall, the armchair had migrated to the window. It's better this way, Linda explained when Margaret froze in the doorway. You can see the TV more clearly. This is my furniture, Margaret said quietly. In my apartment. So what? Linda crossed her arms. I just moved it. Or is that forbidden now, too? Margaret turned and walked to her room. Closed the door, lay down on the bed, and stared at the ceiling. Okay. Enough. She wasn't going to tolerate this anymore. Tomorrow she would fix all of it. Tomorrow she would take her life back. She lay there thinking about what she would say. How she would say it. Which words to choose. And the more she thought, the calmer she became. A cold calm, the kind that comes before a storm. She knew exactly what she was going to do. And she was going to do it. Christopher came in late, lay down next to her, and fell asleep immediately. Margaret stayed awake for a long time. She listened to his breathing, looked at the shadow cast by the street lamp on the ceiling, and thought about how soon everything would change. There was no fear. Only resolve. Saturday began with yet another argument. Margaret woke up around 9, perfectly normal for a weekend. She walked into the kitchen and discovered the washing machine running. Linda was doing laundries, of course, her own. Good morning, Margaret said as she poured herself a glass of water. Linda grunted without looking away from the TV, where a morning health show was playing. Margaret took her blouse and jeans from the laundry basket, things she planned to wash today. She waited for the cycle to finish and was about to load her clothes when Linda suddenly jumped up. What do you think you're doing? She snapped. Doing laundry, Margaret replied calmly. The machine is free. Oh, really? Linda was outraged. I haven't hung my stuff yet. Stop rushing me. Linda, your laundry is already washed, Margaret explained patiently. You can hang it, and I'll wash mine in the meantime. The machine running won't bother you. The nerve of this girl. Linda threw her hands up dramatically. Christopher, son, come here. Christopher shuffled out of the bedroom, sleepy, wearing a wrinkled t-shirt. What's going on? Look. Linda pointed at Margaret. Your wife can't even ask. I haven't hung my laundry and she's already shoving in hers. No respect at all. Margaret stood there with her clothes in her hands and looked at her husband. Christopher rubbed his face with his palm, yawned. Margaret, just wait a bit, he muttered. Mom will hang her stuff, then you can wash. I don't need permission to wash my clothes in my own apartment, Margaret said slowly, meeting his eyes. There she goes again, Christopher groaned. That same song. My apartment, my things. Mom's right, you have no respect. Something inside Margaret clicked. Quietly. Cleanly. Like a switch. She was standing in the middle of the kitchen of her own apartment, holding her own clothes, listening to her husband tell her she lacked respect. Her husband, who lived here for free. Who never invested a cent in these walls. Who brought his mother here and let her take over. I'm tired, Margaret said suddenly. Her voice was quiet, but made of steel. I'm tired of all of this. Tired of what? Linda snorted. Tired because someone asked you to wait a minute? Margaret looked at her. Then at Christopher. And suddenly everything became painfully clear. She wasn't tired of laundry. She wasn't tired of petty complaints. She was tired of having to beg for basic rights in her own home. She was tired of her husband always choosing his mother over his wife. She was tired of them planning her future, her divorce, her apartment, behind her back. I'm tired of you, Margaret said, looking straight at her mother-in-law. And of you, she turned to Christopher. I'm tired of living like a stranger in my own home. Margaret, don't do this, Christopher said, stepping toward her. Let's calm down. No, Margaret cut him off. Enough calm. I've been calm for half a year. I've tolerated, stayed quiet, backed down. And you? You decided you can do whatever you want with me? You discussed how to get rid of me and take my apartment? What? Christopher went pale. Yes, I heard, Margaret's voice rose as she watched both their faces drain of color. I heard your conversation in the kitchen. I heard you, Linda, telling your precious boy how to get rid of me so he could keep the apartment. I heard everything. You were eavesdropping, Linda gasped, grabbing the back of the chair. This is my home, Margaret thundered, and they both flinched. I can stand wherever I want in my home and listen to whatever I want. You two are guests here, temporary guests who overstayed their welcome. Margaret, calm down, Christopher tried again, but his voice shook. No, Margaret said flatly. I won't calm down. I'm done. Choose me or your mother. Silence fell. Linda froze by the table, staring at her son. Christopher stood in the middle of the kitchen, and his face slowly shifted from confusion to a smirk. A smug, confident smirk. He paused for a second, then turned and walked into the bedroom. Margaret heard him open the closet. He pulled her travel bag from the top shelf. She heard him stuffing her clothes inside. Her clothes. Christopher was packing her things. In her own apartment, he was planning to throw her out. Linda stood in the kitchen with her arms crossed, triumph on her face. She'd won. She'd gotten what she wanted. Her boy had chosen mommy over his wife. The apartment would be theirs. Christopher came out of the bedroom with Margaret's sports bag in his hands. Inside were her sweater, jeans, some underwear. He dropped the bag onto the hallway floor and went back for more. And that's when Margaret snapped. This is my apartment, you idiot, she screamed so loudly the windows rattled. And take your mommy with you. Christopher froze in the bedroom doorway with her sweater in his hands. His face slowly, very slowly, went pale. The smirk slid off his lips like melting wax. Linda opened her mouth, but not a single sound came out. They stared at Margaret as if she were a ghost. Margaret walked to the hallway cabinet, yanked open the drawer, and pulled out the folder with her documents. She took out the ownership certificate and unfolded it right in front of her husband's face. Read, she barked, shoving the paper into his chest. Go on, read it out loud. Who's the owner? Christopher stared at the document in silence. His lips moved, but no words came out. I asked, who is the owner? Margaret repeated, her voice ringing with fury. You. Christopher whispered barely audibly. Correct. The only owner is Margaret Eleanor Thompson. This apartment was bought by me before the marriage, with my money, my mortgage, which I paid for 3 years. There is no prenup, which means this apartment is only mine. You are a guest here, the guest by my grace, and your stay has expired. She turned toward Linda, who was still clinging to the back of a chair. Her face was gray, her eyes bulging. And you, Linda, are nobody here, Margaret continued, stepping closer. You came for a month. I let you in out of kindness. I paid for your surgery. I tolerated your behavior, your friends, your TV marathons. And what did you do? You decided this was your home? That you were the lady of the house? That you could plan my divorce and divide my apartment? You wouldn't dare, Linda squealed, her voice trembling and cracking. Christopher, tell her. Tell her this is impossible. Christopher said nothing. He stood there holding Margaret's sweater, silent, because for the first time in 7 months he understood he'd lost. That all the plans his mother made, all their kitchen discussions, all that confidence that the apartment would be theirs, all of it was built on sand, on his own stupidity and entitlement. 20 minutes, Margaret said crisply, throwing open the front door. You have 20 minutes to pack your things and get out. Both of you. Where are we supposed to go? Linda wailed. Outside? You're throwing a sick, elderly woman out on the street. You're not sick, Margaret replied coldly. You're as healthy as a horse. Your leg healed long ago. You just decided to settle in here. But the party's over, Linda. Start packing. Margaret, Christopher finally spoke. Let's talk like adults. I didn't think we didn't mean dash. Shut up, Margaret cut him off. You made your choice. When I told you to choose between me and your mother, you chose, remember? You went to pack my things. Choice made. Now pack yours. And Mommy's. You have 18 minutes. You have no right. Linda shrieked. He's your husband. This is a family. You're destroying a family. You destroyed it, Margaret said calmly, without a flicker of doubt. When you planned my divorce in my own kitchen. When you decided how to take my apartment. When you treated me like a stranger in my own home. You destroyed everything yourselves. I'm just finishing what you started. 17 minutes. Christopher dropped the sweater and walked into the bedroom. Margaret heard him opening the closet, rustling bags. Linda collapsed into a chair and burst into loud, dramatic sobbing. Oh God, why me? My poor son. My baby. Are you really going to let this woman dash? Mom, pack your things, Christopher said dully from the bedroom. What? Linda jumped up. You agree with her? Mom. It's her apartment, Christopher answered tiredly. I didn't know. I thought. But it's hers. But you're her husband. Her legal husband. There must be some justice. Justice? Margaret repeated as she walked into the kitchen. You want justice? Fine. Justice is when you repay the $18,000 for your surgery. Justice is paying for 7 months of living here, utilities, groceries, everything. You want justice? Let's calculate. Linda snapped her mouth shut. Money. She'd forgotten about money. Forgotten that Margaret had actually spent it and no one ever planned on paying her back. That's what I thought, Margaret said with a nod. 15 minutes. If you're not out of here in 15 minutes, I call the police and they'll sort it out. You wouldn't dare. Linda screeched again. We'll see. Margaret placed her phone on the table. 14 minutes. Linda darted into the small room where she'd been living all these months. Margaret heard her grabbing things, shoving them into bags, sobbing and muttering. Christopher silently packed his clothes into a big backpack and a couple of bags. He didn't look at Margaret even once, just packed like a robot. 10 minutes passed. Linda dragged 2 massive bags into the hallway. Her face was red and swollen, mascara smeared, she looked like a parody of herself. Margaret watched her and felt not a shred of pity. This woman wanted to steal her home. This woman plotted to get rid of her. Why should Margaret pity her? I need to make a call, Linda muttered, fumbling with her phone. I have nowhere to go. Call your friend Gloria, Margaret suggested. She has an apartment here in Chicago. Or call one of the others. You have 4. You mean to say none of them can take you in for a few days? Linda dialed with shaking hands, stepped to the window, and spoke in a low, whining voice. Margaret didn't listen. She didn't care where Linda went, as long as it was far from here. Christopher came out of the bedroom with a backpack over his shoulder and 2 bags in his hands. His face was gray, his eyes empty. He looked at Margaret and opened his mouth, clearly wanting to say something, but she shook her head. Don't, she said quietly. Just go. Margaret. Christopher, leave. I don't want to hear anything. He stood there for another second, then nodded and set his things by the door. Linda finished her call and turned to her son. Gloria says we can stay with her, she sniffled. For a week at least, then we'll see. Okay, Mom, Christopher said dully. Margaret walked to the door and flung it wide open. Linda, moving slowly and reluctantly, grabbed one of her bags and dragged it into the hallway. Christopher took the rest. They walked out, and Margaret stood there holding the door open, watching them haul their things onto the landing. I can't carry all this. Linda whined, clutching the doorframe. It's too heavy, my leg dash. Your leg is fine, Margaret cut her off. You've been running around this apartment like a teenager. Carry your bags. I won't leave. Linda suddenly shrieked, clutching the doorframe with both hands. You have no right. No right. Margaret looked at her. Then at Christopher, who stood by the bags, completely lost. And suddenly she laughed, short, sharp, vicious. You won't leave? All right. She pulled out her phone, opened her contacts, and found the number of the local officer she'd saved a year ago after a tenants' meeting. She pressed call. Linda went pale. What are you doing? Calling the police, Margaret said calmly. You're refusing to leave my apartment. So they'll escort you out officially. Mom, let's go. Christopher yanked her hand. Let's just go, don't make her call them. But Dash. Mom. Linda's fingers loosened. She let go of the frame. Christopher took her by the arm and guided her toward the stairs. Margaret hung up. The call hadn't connected yet and stood watching them leave. Watching Christopher drag the bags, watching his mother cling to him, sobbing. Watching them go down the stairs, leaving their things on the landing. Margaret stepped onto the stairwell and glanced down. They were already on the 4th floor. She went back inside, grabbed the last of Linda's bags, carried it out, and set it beside the others. Then she took the apartment keys from her pocket, the one she had given them a few days ago. Actually, she had only given one to Christopher. Linda's key was still lying on the hallway console. Margaret picked them both up and went downstairs. On the 1st floor, near the mailboxes, Christopher and Linda stood surrounded by bags. Linda was crying into her son's shoulder. Christopher was rubbing her back, his own eyes red. Margaret extended her hand with the keys. Keys, she said curtly. Christopher looked at her, then at the keys in his pocket. He took them out and placed them on her palms, 2 brand new, shiny keys. Don't come back, Margaret added. Ever. Margaret, maybe Dash. Christopher, don't. It's over. She turned and walked back to the elevator. Went up to the 7th floor, stepped inside her apartment, and locked the door. Leaned against it with her back and closed her eyes. Inside, there was nothing. No joy, no relief, just emptiness. Exhaustion. She walked into the living room. The couch was still pushed against the wall where Linda had dragged it. Margaret grabbed the armrest and pulled. It was heavy, but she managed. She moved it back to its original place. Then she moved the armchair. After that, she went to the kitchen, opened the fridge, and began throwing out everything Linda had bought or cooked. Jars of jam, dried meat, random salads and containers, all into the trash. When the fridge was empty, Margaret washed the shelves and dried them. Then she went to the bathroom, gathered all of Linda's things, sponges, rags, jars of cream, every leftover item, and tossed them too. She retrieved her own skincare from the storage shelf and arranged it neatly, exactly as it had been before. In the small room Linda had occupied, Margaret threw the window wide open. It smelled like old perfume, stale air, and something sour. She removed the bedding, put it in the washing machine, dusted the surfaces, vacuumed the floor. The room became a room again, not her mother-in-law's den. In the bedroom, she collected the things Christopher hadn't taken: 2 shirts, socks, some papers. She folded them into a bag, tied it shut, and set it by the door. He could pick it up later if he wanted. Or not. She didn't care. By 3 in the afternoon, the apartment was spotless. Margaret stood in the kitchen and looked around. Quiet. No TV blaring, no voices, no complaints. No one telling her she washed dishes wrong or bought the wrong food. Silence. She walked to the window and opened it wide. Fresh air swept into the room, clearing out the last traces of someone else's presence. Margaret inhaled deeply, and something inside her finally loosened. The tension of months slowly uncoiled. Her shoulders relaxed. Her breathing evened out. Her phone rang. Margaret took it from her pocket. It was her mom. She answered. "Hi, Mom." "Margaret, how are you? What's going on over there?" "I'm okay, Mom." "Well, things changed." "What kind of things?" Margaret took a deep breath. Christopher moved out. And his mother too. Silence on the other end. Then her mother's cautious voice. "Did you two divorce?" "Not yet. But I think we will. It's for the best." "Margaret, what happened?" "It's a long story, Mom. I'll explain later. I can't live with him anymore. Or with his mother." "I see. Well, you're an adult, you know what you're doing. The most important thing is that you're okay. If you need help, tell me." "Thanks, Mom. I'll manage." They talked a few more minutes and hung up. Margaret set the phone on the table and looked out the window again. The sun was shining, people were out walking, cars passing by. Just a normal Saturday. And she'd staged a revolution. She threw her husband and mother-in-law out of her apartment. Just like that. No tears, no breakdown. She simply did it. The doorbell rang, making her flinch. Margaret walked to the door and peered through the peephole. Her neighbor stood outside, Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman from the 3rd floor. Margaret opened the door. "Hello, Mrs. Patterson." "Hello, dear. Listen, I saw your husband and his mother leaving with all those bags. Is everything all right?" Margaret smirked. Of course the neighbors saw. Of course they knew. "Everything's fine, Mrs. Patterson. I just decided the guests overstayed their welcome." "Long overdue," Mrs. Patterson nodded. "I was starting to think you were a saint for putting up with that woman. Linda, right? She told everyone you were ungrateful and difficult. But I could see she'd made herself queen of your place. I kept quiet, not my business. But I saw everything." "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson," Margaret said sincerely. "Oh, don't mention it. You stay strong, okay? If you need anything, knock on my door. My nephew's a lawyer, I can give you his number if you need it." "Thank you, but I'm fine for now." Mrs. Patterson nodded, patted Margaret on the shoulder, and headed back down the hall. Margaret closed the door and smiled. The neighbors were on her side. Good. She walked into the bedroom, lay down on the bed, and stared at the ceiling. So quiet. For the first time in 7 months, there were no unwanted presences in her home. No mother-in-law's whining and TV dramas. No Christopher with his endless excuses. Just her Margaret in her apartment, in her bed, in her life. And you know what? She felt good. She lay there thinking about what came next. A divorce, probably. Christopher was unlikely to forgive that kind of humiliation. And she didn't want to forgive him either. He betrayed her. Taken his mother's side when he should have protected his wife. Discussed her divorce and her apartment with Linda. packed her things to throw her out. There was no coming back from that. Margaret got up, walked to the closet, and pulled out an old photo album. She flipped through the pages. Their wedding. Their first trip to the ocean. New Year's Eve. Christopher smiling in every picture, holding her, kissing her. She was looking at him with love. There had been good times once. Once. But that was long ago. Before Linda arrived. Before Christopher showed his real face, weak, dependent on his mother, selfish. Margaret closed the album and shoved it back into the closet. The past was the past. She had a new life now. She went to the kitchen, opened the fridge, and realized it was almost empty. Right. She'd thrown everything out. Margaret smirked, grabbed her purse, and stepped out of the apartment. She took the elevator down and walked outside. The sun warmed her face, the wind lifted her hair. She walked toward the nearest grocery store and felt free. Yes, free. At the store, she took her time. Bought what she liked, not what her mother-in-law used to force onto her shopping list. Yogurts, cottage cheese cups, fresh vegetables, chicken, cheese. There was a line at the register, but Margaret didn't mind. She just stood there, watching the people around her. Ordinary people, an ordinary day. And for her, the special one. Back home, she put everything neatly into the fridge. Boiled water, brewed real tea, not Linda's awful leaves, but her favorite green jasmine. She sat by the window with her cup and looked at the city. Somewhere down there, in those buildings, Christopher and Linda were sitting in Gloria's apartment. Probably talking about what a horrible witch Margaret was. How dare she throw them out? How they'd get back at her. But Margaret didn't care. Let them gossip. Let them seethe. She'd done what she should have done months ago. She protected what was hers, her home, her life, her dignity. And she wasn't ashamed. Not even a little. That evening her friend Katie called. Margaret, how are you? Haven't seen you in ages. I'm okay, Katie. How are you? Hey, want to grab coffee this week? Catch up a little? Sure, Margaret said. I'd love that. They settled on Wednesday and said goodbye. Margaret set the phone down and smiled. She was going to meet a friend. Go to a cafe. Talk about something pleasant, not about a mother-in-law and her tantrums. How nice that sounded. That night she slept deeply, without nightmares or tension. For the first time in months, she didn't dream of Linda barking orders in the kitchen or Christopher ignoring her. She dreamed of the ocean, warm, blue, calm. She walked along the shore, alone, just sand under her feet and the murmur of the waves. Margaret woke up late, around 10. She lay staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence. No banging pots. No blaring TV. Silence. Beautiful, peaceful silence. She got up, showered, made coffee. Sat at the table with her mug and a notebook. Time to plan her next steps. A divorce, of course. She'd need a lawyer, paperwork. Thankfully, the apartment was hers, nothing to divide. Christopher might try to claim some compensation, but he had no grounds. No prenup, but also no investment into the place. Margaret wrote a list: lawyer, documents, court filing. Then she paused, thought for a moment, and added, renovation. Yes. A fresh coat of paint. New wallpaper in the small room Linda had occupied. Let that room become an office, maybe a walk-in closet, anything but a reminder of Linda. Margaret sipped her coffee and planned, and her heart felt light. Strangely light. The breakup didn't hurt. It only relieved her. She realized the love had faded a long time ago. Maybe 3 months back, when Christopher once again sided with his mother. Maybe even earlier. She just hadn't wanted to admit it. She'd been afraid of being alone. Afraid she wouldn't cope. But now she knew she would. She had coped yesterday. Thrown both of them out without flinching. She could handle everything else. By Sunday evening, Margaret felt almost happy. She looked around her apartment, clean, quiet, empty of someone else's presence, her home again, and she smiled. The road ahead might get bumpy. The divorce, potential drama, maybe Christopher trying to come back. But she was ready. Ready to protect what was hers. Ready to move on, without him, without his mother, without the nightmare that had lasted 7 months. She sat on the couch, turned on music, not her mother-in-law's TV dramas, but her own music, closed her eyes and just listened. And it felt good. Monday started with Margaret waking up at 7:30 and realizing with pleasure no one was clattering pans in the kitchen. Silence. She stretched, smiled, got up. Showered, took her time getting ready for work. Made real coffee, ate a yogurt, the same one her mother-in-law used to call chemical junk for fools. Then she sat by the window with her mug, watching the city wake up under the morning sun. At the office, Susan noticed the change immediately. "Margaret, did you go on vacation or something?" she asked, poking her head in. "You look—" "I don't know, refreshed." "You could say that," Margaret smirked. "I rested a little." "Well, thank God. You looked exhausted these past few months." Work flowed easily. Margaret sorted documents, answered calls, met with clients. Nothing special, yet everything felt lighter now. Work distracted her from the weekend's events, and for once she didn't mind. Around lunchtime, an unfamiliar number called. Margaret answered. "Hello?" "Margaret, it's me." Christopher's voice sounded dull, tired. She paused for a moment, then replied evenly, "I'm listening. I need to pick up the rest of my things. Can I stop by tonight?" "No." "What do you mean, no?" "I mean no. I'm not letting you in. I packed your things at the bags by the door. Tell me where you're staying, and I'll bring it." "Margaret, I'm not a stranger. Why can't I step into the apartment?" "Because it's my apartment," she said calmly. "And I don't want you in it. Give me the address, or I'll leave your things on the landing. Tonight." "Are you serious?" "Completely. Decide quickly, my lunch break is ending." Christopher was silent for a moment, then gave her the address, Gloria's apartment in Rogers Park. Margaret wrote it down, hung up, and went back to work. No emotions. Just handling a practical matter. That evening, she drove to Rogers Park. Found the building, went up to the 4th floor, and rang the doorbell. Christopher opened. His face looked sunken, dark circles under his eyes. Margaret handed him the bag. "Here. If you forgot anything else, make a list. I'll bring it next week." "Margaret, wait." Christopher took the bag but didn't step back. "Let's talk." "About what?" "Well, about everything. Maybe we rushed things? Maybe we can fix this?" Margaret looked at him. At the face that once felt so familiar. At the eyes where she used to see love. Now there was only confusion and a sort of pathetic self-pity. "There's nothing to fix," she said firmly. "You made your choice on Saturday. When you went to pack my things. The choice is made, Christopher. I didn't think. Mom said you're always complaining, that nothing's ever good enough for you. And I don't know, I got angry." "Mom said," Margaret repeated with a faint, bitter smile. "You're 32 years old, Christopher. A grown man. And you still do whatever Mommy tells you. I don't need a husband like that." Margaret dash. "No." Margaret cut him off. "Enough. I'm filing for divorce this week. The apartment stays with me. That's not up for discussion. If you have any claims, we'll see each other in court. That's it." She turned and walked toward the elevator. Christopher stood in the doorway with her bag in his hands, watching her go. Margaret didn't look back. She pressed the button, stepped inside, and only when the doors closed did she allow herself to exhale. That was it. Done. The meeting with her soon-to-be ex-husband was over. She didn't owe him anything anymore. The next day, Tuesday, Margaret booked a consultation with a lawyer. That evening she walked into a small office near the subway, where a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s welcomed her in. Margaret explained the situation briefly. The lawyer listened carefully, nodding. "Everything's clear. The apartment is legally yours, purchased before the marriage. No contributions from his side?" "None. He didn't do repairs, nothing." Then he has no grounds for any claims. You file the petition, and in a month the divorce is final. If he objects, it'll go through court 2 to 3 months. He'll agree, Margaret said confidently. He has nothing to fight for. Great. Bring your documents, your ID, marriage certificate, property deed. We'll draft the petition together. Come back Thursday. Margaret left the office feeling lighter. Everything was moving according to plan. The divorce would be quick and painless. Christopher simply had no leverage. On Wednesday, she met her friend Katie at a cafe near work. When Katie heard about the divorce, she gasped, then leaned in. Honestly? I'm happy for you. What? Margaret blinked. I'm serious. You haven't been yourself these last 6 months. Exhausted, jumpy. I kept wanting to ask what was wrong, but you always brushed it off. And now look at you, you're back. Alive again. Margaret smiled. Yes. Alive. Not a cornered woman hiding in her own home, just Margaret, working, meeting friends, drinking coffee, making plans. Thank you, Katie, she said sincerely. I really needed to hear that. And listen, Katie added in a mock-stern tone. Never again with these mama's boy types. Mother-in-law drama? Giant red flag. See it run. I'll run, Margaret promised, and they laughed. On Thursday, she returned to the lawyer and finalized all the paperwork. On Friday, she filed for divorce. The woman at the clerk's desk looked at her with gentle sympathy. Divorce is never easy, she sighed. But if you've thought it through, you're doing the right thing. Come back in a month for the certificate. Margaret stepped out of the courthouse with a strange, weightless relief. It was official now. The process had begun. In a month she would be free, legally free from Christopher and everything tied to him. The weekend passed quietly. Margaret cleaned, watched movies, read a book she'd been meaning to get to. On Saturday evening her mom called to check in. Margaret told her everything was going smoothly. Her mom hummed approvingly. Well done. A man who can't protect his wife from his own mother isn't worth anything. You did right not to keep suffering. Thanks, Mom. And come visit sometime. Stay for a week. You need a break. Dad's asking about you. I will. Maybe next month. The following Monday, Margaret received a text from an unknown number. It was a long message from Linda. Margaret, I know you're angry at me. But think about it. I'm an older woman. It was hard for me alone in Springfield. Christopher is my only son. I have the right to live near him. You're young, you'll have plenty of chances to find another husband. I only have Christopher. Let's forget everything. You forgive us, we forgive you. Christopher is ready to come back. We'll all live peacefully, I promise. Margaret read it twice. Then laughed. The audacity. Linda even managed to make herself the victim and imply that Margaret was the one needing forgiveness. As if, Margaret muttered. She typed a short reply. Linda, there will be no conversation about reconciliation. I've filed for divorce. I suggest you return to Springfield and leave me alone. I won't respond to any more messages. She sent it, blocked the number, and exhaled. Done. All ties cut. Another week passed. Margaret slowly returned to normal life. She went to work, met with friends, even signed up for yoga, something she'd wanted to do for years but never had time for. Now she had time. Her apartment no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a home again. On Friday evening, walking back from work, her phone rang. Christopher. She picked up, though she wanted to decline. What? Margaret, Mom said you were rude to her. Christopher, I'm not discussing your mother. We have nothing to talk about anymore. But she just wanted to make peace. I don't need peace, Margaret said tiredly. I need a divorce. In 3 weeks it will be finalized. Please don't call me anymore. Don't text me. Don't show up. We're strangers now. Margaret, I love you, Christopher suddenly said, his voice trembling. Really? I understand what I did. Give me a chance to fix everything. Margaret stopped in the middle of the sidewalk. People walked around her, rushing somewhere. She stood still, phone pressed to her ear, wondering what to say. He loved her? Really? But would a man who loved her pack her things to throw her out of her own home? Would a man who loved her discuss divorcing her and stealing her apartment with his mother? No. A man who loved her would never have done any of that. No, Christopher, she said firmly. You don't love me. You love convenience. You love the version of me who endured everything, forgave everything, solved everything for you. I'm not doing that anymore. Goodbye. She hung up, slipped the phone into her pocket, and kept walking. Inside, she felt calm. No doubts. No regrets. Just a quiet certainty that she'd done the right thing. At home, Margaret changed clothes, heated up dinner, and sat by the window with her plate on her knees. She looked out at the city lights and thought about the future, about the fact that in 3 weeks she'd officially be free. She could renovate, rearrange furniture, change anything she wanted. She could finally take that trip to Greece she'd been saving for. The one she gave up to pay for her mother-in-law's surgery. Now she could save again and go. Alone or with Katie. Without Christopher. Without his mother. Without the burden she'd carried for 7 months. On Saturday morning, exactly 2 weeks after she kicked out Christopher and Linda, the doorbell rang. Margaret glanced through the peephole and saw both of them standing on the landing. Linda clutched a paper bag. Christopher looked determined. Margaret didn't open the door. She spoke through it instead. Leave. I'm not letting you in. Margaret, please open, Christopher begged. We need to talk. We have nothing to talk about. Leave or I'll call the police. Margaret, we brought you a pie. Linda suddenly wailed. I baked it myself, your favorite, with apples. Let's forget all the bad things, okay? A pie. They brought a pie. Margaret pressed her forehead against the door and closed her eyes. Unbelievable. Linda really thought a pie would fix everything. As if offering baked goods erased 7 months of hell. As if she could ring the doorbell, hand over dessert, and Margaret would forgive them, let them in, pretend nothing had happened. Leave, Margaret repeated. I'm not opening the door. Not today, not tomorrow, never. You're not my family. You're strangers. Go. Margaret, come on now. Linda raised her voice. We're kin. You're my son's wife. You can't act like this. Let's talk like civilized people. Linda, when you were plotting to kick me out of my own apartment, were you being civilized? Margaret asked coldly. When you told your son I was a career-obsessed nobody who didn't belong next to him, was that civilized? When you ran my home for 7 months, threw away my food, and talked down to me, did you remember we were kin? That's not true. Linda screeched. I didn't dash. I heard you, Margaret cut her off. With my own ears. So stop lying. Leave. I'm asking one last time. And if we don't? Christopher suddenly asked, anger edging into his voice. What are you going to do? I'll call the police, Margaret said calmly. And they'll escort you out. With a report for disturbing the peace. Your choice. Silence. Then shuffling steps. Linda mumbling. Christopher hissing at her under his breath. Margaret listened as they walked down the stairs. She went to the window and peeked out. There they were on the sidewalk, Linda sobbing into a handkerchief, Christopher staring up at the building as if trying to guess which window was hers. Margaret stepped back so he wouldn't see her. They stood there for about 5 minutes before heading toward the bus stop. Margaret watched them go, thinking. That must have been the last attempt. Now they'll understand I wasn't bluffing. It really is over. Another week passed. No calls. No messages. Silence. Margaret went to work, to yoga, met with friends, lived the normal life that had been stolen from her and that she'd taken back. On Thursday evening, as she came home, she noticed a bag sitting on the landing by her door. She approached carefully and looked inside. Christopher's things. The ones he'd forgotten, the ones she'd intended to drop off. There was also a note, scribbled on a torn notebook page. Took everything. Won't bother you again. Christopher. Margaret crumpled the note and tossed it down the trash chute. The bag was empty. Good. Another loose end tied up. The month passed quickly. On the appointed day, Margaret went to the courthouse and received her divorce decree. The clerk handed her the document, and Margaret took it with an odd, quiet sense of closure. That was it. She was free legally, officially free from Christopher, from his mother, from everything that connected them. She walked outside, sat on a bench in a nearby square, and took out the decree. She looked at the stamps, the signatures. Marriage dissolved between Margaret Eleanor Thompson and Christopher James Miller. Date. Seal. Done. She slipped the document into her bag and looked up at the sky. October was warm that year. The sun was gentle, the leaves only just starting to turn yellow. Beautiful. Peaceful. Margaret pulled out her phone and texted her mom. Divorce is finalized. It's official. I'll come visit this weekend, okay? The reply came almost instantly. Of course, sweetheart. We're waiting. Dad already started getting your room ready. Margaret smiled. Her parents, they were always there for her. She got up and headed toward the subway. On the way, she stopped at a cafe, bought herself a large cappuccino and a croissant. Sat by the window, sipping her coffee, watching people pass by. People rushing places, smiling, frowning, living their lives. And she, Margaret, was finally part of her own life again. Not a trapped daughter-in-law, not a victim of someone else's entitlement. Just a woman enjoying coffee on a warm October afternoon. That evening at home, Margaret stood in the kitchen making dinner. She turned on some soft music. Chopped vegetables for a salad, set chicken to simmer. She moved slowly, peacefully, savoring the moment. Before, cooking had been a duty, a way to avoid Linda's complaints. Now it was simply making food for herself, with pleasure. After dinner, she washed the dishes, wiped down the table, and walked into the living room. She sat on the couch, the same couch she dragged back into place after Linda moved out, and leaned against the backrest. Silence. Beautiful, calm silence. No TV dramas, no whining, no voices that didn't belong. Margaret closed her eyes and thought about what came next. Life would go on. Work, friends. Maybe new hobbies. She wanted to take Spanish classes, she'd been planning that for ages. Now she finally could. She wanted that trip to Greece, now she could save for it again. She wanted to simply live without fear that someone would barge into her world and start running it. She opened her eyes and looked around her apartment. The walls, the furniture, the windows glowing with evening light. This was her home. Her space. And no one would take it from her again. No one would ever make her feel like a stranger here. Margaret stood, walked to the window, and opened it wide. Fresh air rushed in, carrying the smell of fall and freedom. Somewhere below, children were laughing, cars rolled by, the life moving on. And in that life, Margaret finally had her own place. A steady, peaceful, safe place. She smiled at her reflection in a glass and thought, it worked out. I did it. I protected myself, my home, my dignity. And now, a new life begins. Margaret closed the window, drew the curtains, and went to get ready for bed. Tomorrow would be a new day. A good day. Her day. And she would greet it with a smile.